let me just welcome everybody who has joined us today. So the room is filling up virtually, as we say. I want to thank everybody for joining us in this panel discussion where we'll be launching the Cyber Arms Watch. My name is Luc Vossen. I'm a senior strategic analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and I'll be chairing and moderating this session going forward. So let me first maybe explain the setup for today, and so you know what you can expect. And also note that this session will be recorded and also published afterwards on the HCSS website. We'll kick off with a word of welcome by Ms. Saskia Bruyness, the Deputy Mayor of The Hague. So thanks to the support of the municipality, we're also able to create the Cyber Arms Watch Monitor. So thanks to Saskia and the municipality for their generous support. Afterwards, I will then give a short demonstration of the Cyber Arms Watch, what it is, why we made it, how it works. And afterwards, we have an amazing panel of speakers to talk about transparency around offensive cyber capabilities, where we are right now, and some of the challenges that nations might be facing basically in this sphere. So maybe first of all, unfortunately, Nathalie Jaarsma, the cyber ambassador of the Netherlands, was not able to join us due to another appointment. But we do have some other excellent speakers lined up. So first of all, James Andrew Lewis. He is the Senior Vice President at CSIS, and he's also the Director of the Strategic Technologies Program. Now, Jim really has an unparalleled experience in the field of cyber diplomacy, where he has served as a rapporteur and advisor to, I believe, 4 GGEs on cyber.
Yes.
There you go. He's also the American lead for the Track 2 cyber dialogue between the US and China, a very long-standing Track 2 on cyber issues between the two nations. Then we have Alison Pitlag, who has worked on arms control and disarmament for over a decade. She's the program manager in the disarmament program for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, so the WILP. She's worked on arms control and disarmament for so long, not only in cyber, but on it like in a much wider field even than that. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center, where she focuses on international cybersecurity issues. And I know Alison, first and foremost, from playing an instrumental role in facilitating all the civil society input into this like first committee UN open-ended working group discussions on cyber, which you know, she should receive a lot of kudos for. So thanks again for that, Alison. Finally, we have Max Nates. Now, Max is a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. And he's also the director of the European Cyber Conflict Research Initiative. Max also recently published his book, No Shortcuts, Why States Struggle to Develop a Military Cyber Force. Now, Max will be joining us later as we start the panel. He's currently on his way to SciCon, so he will be joining the conversation a little bit later. So after the first round of questions, basically from the panelists, we then have a Q&A all the way at the end. So please don't hesitate to submit your questions using the designated Q&A function. So there's a Q&A button. Please use that one rather than the chat function. I will try our best to address most of all the questions in that second half of the panel. I believe that's all the admin from my end. So I will now give the floor to Deputy Mayor Saskia Bruyness from the municipality of The Hague. Saskia, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Luc. Very nice to be here, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to congratulate the HCSS on the successful development of this arm watch. Your team, the team of HCSS, has already made significant progress with the tool over the last year. So sadly, we had to delay this launch a few times due to all restrictions, we all know. But here we are together, and it's a beautiful thing. And I think this instrument, like the arm watch, make a direct contribution to peace and security. It's important for The Hague, and that's why we are so proud to host a think tank like the Center of HCSS. Peace and security is of very great importance for The Hague. As the International City of Peace and Justice, we host a lot of embassies, NGOs, international organizations, and as cyberspace has become an increasingly volatile environment, so too are these organizations increasing at risk of cyber attacks. Geopolitical tensions at the state level have a trickle-down effect on our ecosystem and all local ecosystems. And for cyberspace, this is no different. And let me tell you that at the start of this year, the Red Cross fell victim to a large-scale cyber attack. It is, though, that personal information of over 500,000 vulnerable people were taken. And 8 years ago, this June, human rights activist Salwa Bukaikis, she was murdered in Libya in her own home. Her assassins had gotten hold of her address through a hack of the Hague-based NGO for which she was active. And I can go on with many, many more examples. But it's clear enough that why this issue matters to us. Cybersecurity will remain high on the agenda for the city government in the coming years. Last February, we published our strategy for a cybersecure The Hague. The strategy offers guidance for strengthening the cyber infrastructure in the city and its high-risk organizations. So in this light, we are eager to collaborate with HCSS on this first phase of the Arms Watch. I hope the instrument will lead to more transparency among state actors regarding their cyber capabilities, and because that will make this world just a little bit safer, also for the people in your countries and right here in The Hague. So I wish you a very good discussion together. It's nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those kind remarks, Saskia, and also, of course, for supporting the Cyber Arms Watch to this extent, and also for the overall leadership that you've shown pushing forward the digital or cyber portfolio for the city of The Hague. So let me now explain the Cyber Arms Watch and what it does. So we have a PowerPoint presentation, a couple of slides prepared, basically. So the Cyber Arms Watch really offers the first transparency index on offensive cyber capabilities of 60 states. And it does so by comparing two ratings. First, we look at the declared capabilities. So what the government discloses on this. So for example, what the government communicates in their strategies, doctrines, or any other official document. But at best, this gives you an incomplete view, since a lot of the countries have not disclosed much information, even though we know that they engage in this kind of offensive activity. So we then compared it to how those capabilities are perceived by outside sources or outside views. And for that, we use a lot of intelligence reports, both by foreign government actors or by, for example, industry. So think about attributions, indictments, news articles, academic sources. And the transparency index is basically the delta between those two, which allowed us to cluster nations together. And why we're doing this is actually because the arms control discussions and the framework for cyber really and stability discussions are really at the beginning phase. So compare it to where 1950s are for the nuclear weapons. Of course, the geopolitical context is now completely different from then, but those discussions are still very much in the beginning. And what we see in the past is that more transparency about those weapons systems have traditionally led to better stability measures, so better norms, CBMs, etc. To the next slide, please, about the labeling. So as you should see now is basically the main rest of our methodology. So it's the labeling system that we use is 6 tiered levels from 0 to 6 for both capabilities. So for both the declared and the perceived capability rating. So from the left onwards, so you can see that from level 3 onwards, we're talking about an offensive cyber capability, really in the sense of like offensive cyber effect operations. So really where they have that kind of effect, like a disruptive, or destructive effect. And we then make a distinction for the declared capabilities and what kind of like the level of detail of what states are publishing. So for example, about their TTPs or their command structure or budgets. And from level 3 to 5, you can see like an increasing granularity in the documents that they publish about their offensive cyber capabilities. For the perceived capabilities, this is again the same thing. So from level 3 onwards, we're talking about cyber effect operations. But it is basically increasing in terms of scale and also in terms of the sophistication and impact of these operations and that they had so far. So really going from the more disruptive things to the destructive thing at the very end. So by level 3 onwards, we're really talking about what we traditionally understand as cyber effect operations with those things. Above that, so from 1 to 2, we're talking about mostly aspirational statements, so states that want to develop these things or in process of developing these capabilities. And also on the perceived capability rating, it's mostly about, again, those aspirations, but also intelligence operations or spyware. So for that, we still deemed it useful to include that category, but at a lower ranking, because usually it is kind of a precursor for more offensive or like cyber effect operations. It gives an indication of where our state is. So going on to the next slide, we also, you can see currently we have around 60 nations that we're dealing with. The selection criteria basically was that at least there needs to be a cybersecurity strategy of a country. And then there also needs to be sufficient data that at least 4 sources basically for the ratings for us to continue the work basically and publish this work. So we've narrowed it down or expanded it to 60 nations currently. And then going on to the next slide, we also want to highlight some of the limitations basically. So what we see is that offensive cyber capabilities are very difficult to measure objectively. This also stems from the inherent ambiguity and uncertainty and duality of cyberspace, basically as a general, and the kind of operations that take place in this environment. But I just want to highlight some of them. So first one is definitions. There are, at the same time, no definitions and a complete abundance of definitions, but no commonly agreed definitions on what these capabilities are, leave alone what a cyber weapon is. That is not something that has been currently defined. We rather approach it, or the community has rather approached it as cyber capabilities and cyber operations. But we therefore also opted for more broadly used labels basically when we went ahead and reviewed all the sources. But it makes it difficult because states are not using the same lingo. So it makes it difficult to sometimes compare these two. Then ambiguous language. A lot of governments are actually trying their darndest to avoid having to use the word offensive capability. They become very creative in using terms like active defense or other things. Now, for example, for a term like active defense, there's a lot of literature on that. So we have included it in the labeling. But for many other wordings, for example, like proactive response, remains too vague. And what we then do is when the language is not explicit enough, we still include it in the source in the database, but they remain unlabeled. So they don't weigh in the score, because otherwise it would defeat the purpose of transparency if a government really is being so extremely vague that there, there's doubts about whether about its offensive nature. But they do offer some context, so we still want to include them. Then there's obviously some language limitations having to do with understanding the linguistic and cultural context of the nation and also doing all the translations. But also data availability and bias. On the one hand, there's a lack of data when we talk about declared capabilities, so official communication by governments. There's an increase, there's an improvement for many, let's just say, like-minded nations. But we also observed a data bias when it comes to the perceived capabilities. So that mainly has to do with, there's a lot of Western nations and organizations that report about, for example, Chinese, Russian, Iranian operations. But there's not a lot of Chinese, Russian, or these kind of sources that report on Western or like-minded operations. So there is a more skew towards, or a bias, what we observe basically in that sense. And then finally, there's also unclear state proxy relations. Cyber is often used as for plausible deniability to the government. So while the attribution capability has increased, it's still sometimes difficult to ascertain the exact state proxy relationship, and only when there was a clear government involvement, basically when it's attributed to a state, or when it was considered to be state-sponsored, we have still include it and we label it. And when an APT, for example, is not attributed to a state, we still include it, but again, we do not label it. So it offers context when there are expectations or thoughts that there might be state involvement, but it cannot be proved. It remains basically unlabeled and it doesn't weigh in the score. Let's move on to the monitor itself. So we can stop sharing this, and we will actually show you the Cyber Arms Watch itself. So I think what you can see here now is the monitor that we have developed. Again, we are approaching this from the declared, perceived capabilities, and then finally the transparency index itself. Having looked at basically the declared capability, what you see is that everything has a short summary of the nation. You see also the data availability rank. So that means position 1 is the best one to be at. The US has the most documents published on its offensive cyber capabilities, a lot of military doctrines that have been made publicly available. And you also see the number of documents, and also good to see is that all the data or underlying data that we've used to this end, we have included in the monitor, and they're also in the reports. So basically, if you want to see how we labeled anything, you can check it to the last details. So basically, you have all the documents in here, and you also included the excerpt that we believe proves that, or summarizes the document, which warrants them in a specific label. So we really provide full transparency in how we've adopted it. We've sometimes noticed in the past with some other indexes is that it's kind of a black box. You don't really, you see the methodology, but not at the end how they, came to the end result. If you click on any of these documents, you will also be redirected to the web page that has the basically houses the resource. So for this, the declared capabilities, you see that the US is by far the, but also, the country that has reported the most about this, is of course the highest. But there were also some surprises, such as, for example, Brazil, which the Brazilian government has published a lot of documents, basically. But it really confirms a lot of what we know already. A lot of the Western European nations have been increasing. Or like there's an upward trend in a lot of them declaring that they have offensive capability, following suit after the US. But for most of them, we see that they're still, that's the end. So they don't really don't share much details that go beyond that mere acknowledgement of an offensive capability. The UK obviously has a little bit more details that they've published, and really the countries in yellow, they score the worst with, Russia, Iran, North Korea, for example, but also China to a certain extent. It's an interesting outlier. Sometimes they have an official stance of peaceful use and don't share much, but there's quite a lot in the military strategy documents that can be found about acknowledging offensive capability, basically, of the strategic support force. Then moving on to the perceived capabilities. It's basically a similar setup. And here you see, for example, for Russia, the data availability rank, it's the second one. It has 83 documents. Again, all the data is published here. And here we're really seeing about how these the capabilities of states are perceived by outsiders. So we see it really confirms the view that I think many experts already had. By far, Russia, the US, Russia, China, UK, Israel, all rank very highly in this monitor. So those are the ones in blue, and then the ones in yellow are basically still under development. So then you see you're falling under that level 3. It's mostly intelligence operations or statements of aspiration for that government to develop an offensive capability. Finally, there's the transparency index itself, which basically is the delta between the two. And it allowed us to cluster these nations together in different groupings. And we made a separation between, on the one hand, the level of transparency that they've shown in their documents, so how big the delta is. But then at the other end, also in terms of their capability, because what you sometimes see is that, nations such as the US, which is highly advanced cyber power, it also means more when it is more transparent about its capabilities rather than a nation which, let's just say there is almost no, or there is only statements of aspiration, right? So we decided to make a distinction also between a low and high capability as we perceive them. It reinforces some of the views that I think a lot of experts already know. Russia, Iran, North Korea, very untransparent, scoring the highest delta between them, from a 0 to 5, not sharing any information about their offensive capability, while at the same time being perceived as being very offensive or very engaged in offensive capabilities. So this is basically the monitor as itself. Again, all the data is made public. There's also a report that basically summarizes it. So I really suggest everyone to just visit hcss.nl, the resources there. Everything is made publicly available, basically. Stopping the share now, I would also maybe explain a little bit the follow-up stages of this project. So first, with the help of the municipality of The Hague, we're able to actually build this monitor. And there's a lot of follow-up stages or add-ons that you could think of for this project, in the sense of the first one would be to convene a board, the transparency board, sort of say, that would help, well, basically with the validation of the results and making a more robust methodology. Because right now, we have done all the labeling basically as HCSS. We've done some interviews where possible to get some feedback, but it is still a Western-based think tank that is labeling this. So we would like to maybe convene a transparency board of a consortium of all regional experts within this field, and to have a more to end up with a better result essentially at the end. And the database itself would then allow itself for a more cluster analysis. So we now have a pretty extensive database of all the statements by governments, of what they say about their offensive capability and what a lot of the other outsiders say about that nation. And that would really lend itself to cluster analysis, for example, or trend analysis and offensive capabilities, of offensive trends more generally. But you could also think about new allies or gaps, basically, the gap analysis in the field of arms control or any other the discussions on norms, for example, within the UN. So those are like potential add-ons. Right now we understand that the methodology was quite simple, straightforward to begin with. And there's a lot of add-ons that you could think of, adding more granularity or level of detail, basically, to these to this index and to the labeling system. Because right now, how it compares to, for example, other indexes. So think about the Belfer Center. They did an index on cyberpower, but IISS has also published on cyberpower. They look at it much more broadly, and when it comes to the offensive component, they really want to try to assess the quality of an offensive program within a nation. Where that's not our primary focus. Our angle really is focused on transparency, so showing how those declared capabilities compare to how they're perceived by outsiders. But you can think about adding more details, so that would allow you, for example, looking at how big the budget is, or looking at how the quality of the doctrines or strategy documents themselves, or the institutional power, basically, or the mandate. So there's a lot of add-ons that you can bake into this, which gets you closer to that quality assessment, basically, that other indexes have done in the past. So if there's any question, basically, again, I'll try to bulk them all together when it concerns the Cyber Arms Watch monitor itself, and I'll try to answer them at the end. But that's basically the general overview, and I think we can now turn to our excellent panel of speakers. I will do a first round of questions to the panelists, so they each have 5 minutes to answer for their opening comments, basically. And afterwards, we turn to the Q&A with the audience, basically with all of you. So don't hesitate to use that Q&A button. So starting off with Jim. Jim, why is there actually, according to you, why do you believe there to be a need for more transparency on offensive cyber capabilities?
Thanks, Luke, and thanks to HCSS. Hi to Max and Allison, good to see you both. So it's been 12 years since the first agreement on responsible behavior in cyberspace, and that first agreement included it was very short, and it included a reference to confidence building measures. The intent was to increase stability and reduce the chances of conflict and miscalculation. That agreement's been successful in regional organizations like the OSCE, ARF, OAS. But we're not going to convert our opponents, right? So then a good question is, what are the benefits? Why do we need to be doing this? And I think there are some. It's an obstacle that cyber operations are connected so closely to intelligence operations States will, of course, be circumspect in sharing information on that, but there still are benefits. So what are they? And it's in some ways kind of like unilateral transparency, in that if we have two sides to the conflict, one side is not going to share and is certainly not going to be honest. But you can begin by saying this transparency educates the public to understand and support the need for cyber operations. It could, if it's done right, increase acceptance of justifiable operations. There are operations that are understandable and acceptable that the public needs to understand. And one of the things that comes up in discussions of collective action is the need for democracies to be able to persuade their parliaments and publics that the actions make sense and are appropriate. It's a way to test public domain intelligence. So one difference between 12 years ago and now is the amount of material is much greater than it was. People pay much more attention. A lot of it's bad, but I think you have an opportunity to provide some steering points that will help guide people to more accurate understandings. Information sharing increases and improves collaboration and allows people to share best practices. We know that within NATO, there's an active process, but there's other parts of the world, and I want to talk about that. So it's useful in that sense. It gives a way to gauge adherence to norms and to international law. And international law is the most important here, because you have certain considerations under international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict, that should shape doctrine and tools. The most obvious being the need to avoid collateral damage or to hit targets that aren't justified under international law. So I think that this sort of transparency can be useful. Finally, and the thing that you alluded to in your final remark, and I think is the most important, is, I said this was a bilateral contest in some ways. It's really not. It's at a minimum a trilateral contest. There's the democracies, there are the non-democracies, and then there's everybody else. And they're not necessarily converted to our views. They are skeptical, and reasonably so. So I think transparency gives us an opportunity to help the rest of the world understand actions that are being taken, understand the need for norms of responsible state behavior, and understand how international law and international humanitarian law are applied to cyber operations. So a difficult circumstance given the opacity of the arena and the lack of veracity of our opponents, but there are some real benefits we can get. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. I was hoping for an analogy within the chipmunks and tigers, but maybe that's for later as well. So then turning to Allison. So Allison, we see that a lot of states are still lagging behind in this field, not sharing that much information. So I was wondering, given your background as well within other fields, can you share your thoughts on like how we can actually encourage states to be more transparent in this field? Thanks.
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. And also, let me just offer my congratulations on the launch of the monitor. It's evident that a lot of work and careful research has gone into this, and I think it's a really important and strong contribution. WILPF has been speaking up and speaking against the weaponization of ICTs and militarization of cyberspace for some time now. And as part of that, we've been registering concern about the growth and spread of governmental offensive cyber capabilities. And I recognize, of course, that there is debate out there about how neatly one can separate out offensive versus defensive. And there is terminology out there that acknowledges and accounts for this, as Luke explained. But generally speaking, having a resource like this monitor, I think, is extremely useful for painting a picture of where things are at right now, and hopefully will help to push the needle towards greater transparency by shining some light on what is a deliberately and by nature shady or gray area, but one with increasing significant implications for international peace and human security. But with respect to your question, you know, in some ways, I think that this is the question that many civil society organizations and researchers across a wide spectrum of international security issues are always asking is how to encourage more transparency from states. And you know, the bad news is I don't have one very clear-cut answer, and in some ways, I really wish I did, including for my own work and advocacy. But I do have a few thoughts to offer. So I think first, in looking at the experience of working in other issue areas, including some that are also considered to be rather sensitive, what has often been most effective in encouraging transparency is demonstrating why and how transparency is in a state's own interests, which usually comes from a place of states wanting to know, you know, what other states are doing in this space in order to maintain some stability and for their own protection or defense, and realizing that getting that information might mean that they too have to give up some information. But what is different with cyber capabilities and has already, I think, come up in some of the questions that we've seen is that transparency about cyber capabilities is different than transparency about weapons capability or possession as one example. In the latter case, it's, you know, it's always been perceived by states as important to showcase and make clear what they have as a form of power projection. But cyber, of course, is different, as we know. It's been to the aggressor's advantage to be stealthy and even somewhat invisible about their capabilities and operations. So in this case, some of the usual incentives or encouragements to be transparent, maybe they're just not, they don't exist here, or they're less applicable or less persuasive. And so we might need to start looking to some other levers or arguments to demonstrate why being transparent with cyber capabilities is also within a state's interest. And I think that, you know, Jim hit on a lot of these already in his statements. You know, maybe some other sort of carrots that we could point to are talking about, you know, cyber restraint, reducing the likelihood of miscalculation and escalation. I really like the point about transparency being a way to gauge how norms in law are being applied. And I think that other arguments could also include, you know, about a state's own security and cyber resilience, recognizing the transboundary nature of ICTs and the sort of knock-on effects that can be had from a single operation. As a sort of global commons, it's within all states' interest to really work together to maintain cyber peace and stability. But I think a second point that I wanted to make is that, you know, we're talking today about transparency and offensive cyber capabilities, but I would offer that transparency should be encouraged in other areas of cyber policy, diplomacy, and governance as well. And, you know, just to take one example in the context of the UN cyber norms processes, there has been recently this very clear call from UN member states to their peers to publish and disclose their national interpretation of how international law applies to cyberspace and to state behavior in order to better understand where they each are coming from and help to arrive at common understandings. So I think that some of the arguments that we're hearing for transparency in these other areas of cyber policy and practice could also be carried over and used as encouragements for transparency around capabilities too. And then my third and kind of final point on this is that I think there are some practical things that maybe the international community can do to encourage transparency, whether that is about the offensive capabilities or other aspects of policy and practice. States that have published or shared that they have offensive cyber capabilities can encourage other states to do the same or work collectively with interested non-governmental stakeholders to develop some more focused arguments and encouragements. I think one of the things, Luke, that you pointed out is that the information that has been offered up differs a lot across states, from sort of blanket acknowledgements to more detailed policy. So here too might be a space for some states to work with other member states to encourage the same level of detailed information sharing. Relevant multilateral forums, whether at regional or international levels, could also encourage or maybe, you know, explicitly call for more transparency in this area. Possibly they could devote time in their meeting agendas for discussions of this topic. I feel like public pressure is sort of strangely absent on this particular topic, but it could be a lever to look for in advocating for greater transparency. I think that right now this is something that researchers and a subset of the policy community are discussing, but it's not really in the general or public eye. It's possibly that's because the human impact and cost of cyber operations has been less well documented or disseminated. And so better tracking of that might help to propel some kind of public conversation about this that could also help to encourage transparency. And I think that resources like the Cyber Arms Watch and Monitor, along with a cyber policy portal and the National Survey of Implementation, are also really good things that are helping to advance transparency across the board. So I think I'll stop there, and I look forward to the other questions and the discussion.
Great, thanks, Alison. So now moving to Max, who is joining us from Tallinn, I believe. So Max, you also recently wrote a book, or you just recently published it, on the challenges of setting up those cyber commands, or the challenges that a lot of nations face when setting it up. Can you talk us about some of the trends and the challenges you see in that integration of offensive cyber capabilities within those military organizations? Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Luke, and congratulations on the launch of the Cyber Arms Watch. Really terrific initiative. Also nice to see you, Jim, and hey, Alison. So let me briefly start with a kind of dual observation. Because on the one hand, what we have seen over the past decade is the emergence indeed of an institutionalization of military cyber efforts, where a growing number of countries have established cyber commands or similar units, where of course a great deal of countries have established or have published a cyber strategy where they discuss the need to potentially develop an offensive cyber capability, and they seem to continue to do so. I believe that's also highlighted quite clearly in the Cyber Arms Watch. There is also a second trend, that whilst we have seen a growing number of countries establishing these organizations, we still see relatively few countries conducting cyber effect operations. So those operations that seek to disrupt, deny, degrade, and or destroy. The nuance here is not that we have seen few effect operations, but few countries doing them. Of course, we've seen a great deal of intelligence activity. So it's again, not to say that there is no cyber activity, but from the commands that have been established, we know of relatively little activity that they have been doing, particularly when it comes to, again, doing these activities to disrupt, deny, degrade, and or destroy. So that opens kind of a puzzle. Why is that the case? What explains this growing and potentially persistent gap, or will it change in the future? And you can kind of divide it in two different explanations. The first set of explanations is, well, you know, there wasn't really useful them today, or cyber effect operations aren't really coercive. So perhaps they're talking about it, but ultimately it is, you know, what Adam Liff would call not an absolute weapon, you know, as you would see in maybe other realms and most obviously nuclear weapons. So that could be one argument. The other argument could be, well, actually, you don't need to do these type of operations. Yes, the military has established it, but actually, this is a space that is primarily still intelligence contests, where most of the activity taking place is espionage operations. So that could be a second argument, or the argument that you hear, particularly coming out of also the persistent engagement scholarship in the US, as the key underlying aspect is, well, actually activity below the threshold of armed attack, that most of it is espionage, can cumulatively still be strategically meaningful. And as a result of that, we don't see that many effect ops. Perhaps there is already a norm in place that guides countries' behavior for not doing so, which can be contested as well. Or last, and this is kind of where I'm increasingly siding on, and actually my book is very much focused on, is on the fact that actually it's quite tough to establish a capability in the first place. And we have to look into this in much greater detail. And hence I also very much commend the Hague effort to develop this arms watch that hopefully can provide insights in that as well. Because the moment we actually start to look at cyber capacity development, which ultimately means, You know, hiring, recruiting, training the right people, thinking through your exploit and tool management, when and when you're not going to use, what type of infrastructure you're going to set up for targeting, for finding out the right targets, and how are you organizationally going to integrate your military services with intelligence? And to what degree does this collaboration have negative effects for some of your intelligence activities? The moment you start to think through that and put also, you know, in addition to that certain legal mandate over it, what you notice that particularly for like countries that are part of NATO, or the more responsible actors, or I think more generally democratic countries that Jim talked about, that's actually really, really hard to do. And so that's actually where we are right now. We see in an interesting space where there's a lot talked about, but we should also be aware that many of them are still trying to operationally develop and create a certain capacity to operate in this space. I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to address any questions that may come up.
Great, thanks, Max. And maybe like already a follow-up question for you from my end is I'm very curious to see, I mean, you've done a lot of research on like those nations basically, you know, and how they're integrated. You spoke to a lot of people, but what can you identify as like key success factors, or which nations do you believe, you know, to be leading in this effort of like integrating it within their military space in a very, you know, professional way, which, you know, we know that the US has obviously been doing this for a long time, but maybe some small, from a perspective of small to medium-sized nations, you know, is smaller better, or like is larger better in this sense? Any thoughts that you can share on that moving forward?
Yeah, that's a really cool question. So ultimately, when we talk about capacity development, the most important element are people. So yeah, and perhaps in my book, I developed this PATIO framework: people, exploits, tools, infrastructure, and organization. But ultimately, it's about people that are most important. Recruiting the right vulnerability analysts, your operators, your developers, your system administrators, your frontline office, but above all, not just recruiting them, training them well, and keeping them, retaining them. Because if you don't, that's where capacity degradation comes from ultimately. An element of unlearning, where people who have been on the job for a couple of years are leaving. So the question then becomes, what is the ultimate way of keeping that? Now, what is fascinating and often forgotten is that there is a very important link between strategic outlook and actually the ability to retain, recruit, and develop your talent. Because many of the cyber commands that exist today, particularly in Europe, have a strategic outlook where they can't operate in peacetime, right? They are only there for armed conflict, where they are often supporting other military operations. In peacetime, they may not even do, like for instance, the Dutch Cyber Command, reconnaissance, right? That's left to the intelligence services. What do they do in peacetime? Perhaps the command also exists as a deterrence force, but ultimately they operate in war. But then it's a question, how often do you then operate? If you then have years of not conducting an actual operation, it leads to a massive open question on, again, how you're going to develop the most important element of an offensive cyber capability, which are your people. And what I notice is, whilst countries have really thought this through in different solutions, whether that's doing a lot more exercises or setting up a very sophisticated cyber range, or trying in one way or another to integrate it with intelligence, I see many of them really struggling with that. Now, whilst I've been very critical of US Cyber Command strategy of persistent engagement for a variety of reasons, and particularly when it comes to causing allied friction, there you see it does create benefits, where there is a much clearer peacetime mission that as a result of that also allows you to train and retain your talent in a much more efficient and better manner.
Great, thanks, Max. Jim, if you want to chime in basically on this, or I also wanted to ask a question to you, basically is, you know, what was the underlying reason for the US, according to you, or your thoughts on them sharing so many documents basically and being so transparent about this, and also, you know, observing a complete lack of transparency from, you know, a lot of the nations that we know, you know, for example, Russia, China, Iran. You know, how do you bridge that, right? So on the one hand, you can expect, you know, like-minded nations to become more and more transparent, but, you know, is that, how can you bridge the complete lack of transparency from some of the other nations, basically? Please. Oh, you're muted.
There we go. Sorry, Luke. So first, I'm not sure that the US, or at least Cyber Command, would accept that we're not in a conflict. And so one of the issues that came up as the UN discussions progressed is, what is peacetime in the current environment? Is the line between peace and war as clear as it was perhaps 50 years ago? And I think the general feeling is no. So that's part of why you see this. Part of what you need is, it is a new field. We've had a discussion for a long time in the US, and I think in your note, you said that cyber is in some ways where the arms control was in the 1950s. And so one of the questions has been for a long time here is if we could be fairly open about nuclear doctrine, nuclear strategy, why couldn't we be have the same degree of openness when it comes to cyber doctrine and cyber strategy? And I think over time, if you have a group of people complaining about this for years, eventually it has some effect. And I think there's a sense that demystifying the cyber domain could be helpful. That the reality of the situation is such that not all, but much of the accounting that you see in the media is inaccurate. So how do you improve accuracy? So I think that the final thing is you need to win support in a democracy. You need to have your public support your activities. So those are all the reasons here. But I think the sense that I've gotten from talking to the last 3 commanders of Cyber Command is they don't believe it's peacetime. One of them put it to me this way: we engage with our opponents on a weekly, if not daily basis. So it's a very different domain, not always as visible. And the need to build support for this new kind of conflict, I think, is one of the primary drivers.
Great, thanks. So then turning to another question from the audience, which was on, you already touched upon that, so partly, so why would a government be transparent on its offensive capability, as openness could mean that, it loses, or that capability loses its effect or its effectiveness. And I maybe want to split this in 2. So maybe Alison, or turn to Alison for maybe some of the added value. You already touched upon a little bit, added value for some of the UN discussions. And then maybe Max, you could maybe take the second part, which is about, the effectiveness of that capability and sharing information. Alison?
Yeah. So how would it add value to the UN processes, correct? That's what you asked?
Yeah, well, also why would nations be transparent, basically, and maybe, perceived from the stability kind of angle, and then Max can talk about the operational technical side of things.
Yeah, I think just maybe going back to what I said earlier, one way, or one important way to encourage transparency is showing where and how it's in a state's interest to do so. And so some of those points that I mentioned earlier, I think, could be relevant here. I think understanding that greater transparency in cyber capability is going to help with overall reduction of cyber conflict, the likelihood of being attacked, creating better transparency and information sharing in the space. From there come the arguments about escalation, reducing tension. And so I think, I would just go back to what I said earlier to respond to that, I think we need to think more creatively about why it's in states' interests to be transparent on their cyber capabilities than maybe we have done so far.
Okay, then Max, maybe that combining with, I believe it was the other question, which asking about the offensive cyber capabilities can also not be seen. So maybe some of the different factors of how cyber differs from other weapon systems, basically, and how that affects transparency, please.
Let me take this in a couple of parts.
Sure.
So the first one is around your willingness to be transparent, right? And we've seen this. It would be too simple to say, well, a state can't be transparent about their offensive cyber capabilities, because showcasing any type of transparency will lead to a degradation of its effectiveness. And why, of course, as everyone knows, because we're talking here about a number of different things. right? You can clearly be transparent about your potential willingness to conduct certain operations. And you can even say, you can be transparent about, we have established a military cyber command that seeks to operate in this space. You can even be, so those things will not, which is very different from saying, well, we have got this exploit that is great to use in Safari browser that is supported, with a tool in with Farsi language. And, once you go and explain that, well, perhaps that can, have some influences later on how you're going to use it. But before that, there is quite a bit on which you can be transparent, which doesn't immediately impact your ability to use certain capabilities. And I think that provides a very interesting dynamic right now that I think, is captured in a statement that I've once mentioned to Luke before as well, and comes up by loads of people. You can't parade computer code on the streets of Moscow or Pyongyang. But as a result of that, perhaps there are other ways to signal. You can signal with your strategy, with your commands, and so on. The second part here is then, okay, but what's actually capability? And now I'm echoing my earlier point, and I see also the question of SICO here around, when do you know if they actually use them, and can they be transparent about them, and how does it differ from the conventional domain? But again, we have to be clear on what using cyber capabilities are here. These are not kind of off-the-shelf cyber weapons that then can be shot at and used. Yes, to some degree, you can have a number of exploits that you may want to use later to target a certain system where you have certain tools on the shelf. But ultimately, again, it's about people. And you can't have them just sitting around for years, waiting for the opportunity that you need them. So you need to think through processes to effectively, again, train them and or potentially integrate them with other units to make sure that when the time arises, they're actually able to be effectively deployed. So it's not just this kind of material thing that we're talking about here. We're talking ultimately about skills embedded in people within an organization.
Yeah, very much. I think also maybe to add on is that's exactly also the approach that we've taken within building up this database. It's not that nation will publish anything about its vulnerability that it uses, but it's about how does it define its effects, its operations? How does it define? Does it have a ConOps, order of battle, command structure, publication? Does it have anything public on that? There's a lot of progress that they believe that machines can make in publishing about this to avoid any miscalculation, miscommunication before you even start talking about anything else. But Max, I saw two fingers for you.
Yeah, and there are two other, I think, fascinating elements here, right? One is, of course, how the reputation building takes place. And on the one hand, that can take place through previously conducted operations, of which, of course, if the US would now say, hey, we can gain access to your system to cause some disruption, it's a lot more believable after a whole range of operations starting from Stuxnet than it might be for other countries. The other element, and this is something that Martin Libicki has written on, is this strange effect that leaks have had. And I don't know how much they've been included in the Arms Watch, please correct me here, Luke, that leaks have had on reputation, where particularly he says, if you look at the Snowden leaks and then later leaks like Vault 7 and so on, in some ways they've been the most embarrassing episodes for the NSA and then later CIA. But at the same time, they've actually led in some ways also to some type of reputation building where it's suddenly created this awareness of what the US intelligence services are capable of in a way that doesn't exist in the same degree with other countries.
Yeah, and for we've also included leak documentation, basically, obviously not under declared, but this is under the perceived capability rating. But yes, from the Snowden leaks, there's been quite some useful documents that were published, both about the US, but also about the UK and how to engage. Then maybe turning also to Jem back is, what are the cases against transparency, right? Whether maybe in the calculations for some nations, why are they untransparent? What would be some of the motivations? And maybe, for some of the like-minded nations, you have to make a distinction between some of the like-minded and maybe some of the, I would say, non-democratic nations and the others.
It might help if we take a step back from the analytical and research perspective and think about this transparency in its political dimension, which is that the goal for, I think, the NATO countries and other allies like Japan and Australia is to build cohesion among them, build cohesion leading to some sort of imposition of consequences. Could involve cyber, but there's a general sense that you need to be reacting to the unconstrained behavior of China and Russia, that they won't change their behavior absent any action, imposition of consequences. So the first political thing, the goal for transparency is to build cohesion. The second goal is to persuade the rest of the world that the imposition of consequences is justified, that it's acceptable. You don't want to see this as a contest between two morally equivalent opponents, because I don't think it is, right? But I'm not sure the rest of the world would agree with me. So persuading them that our actions are justifiable. So put this in the political dimension, and we don't want to worry too much about exposing some capability. We had probably 50 years of discussion of nuclear capabilities without disclosing sufficient details to undercut the applicability of nuclear forces. It was a good discussion. It helped shape policy. We want the same thing in cyber. And one of the biggest advantages that democracies have is they can have this discussion in a way that the other side cannot. The risks are overstated if this is done correctly. You don't have to tell them, we know, here's precisely what we know and what we could do, but you can give them general guidelines. So this is a political advantage for democracies if they push on transparency, a political advantage in building their own cohesion and in helping persuade the rest of the world that what they're doing is legitimate and justified.
Thanks, Jim. Very clear. Then turning to Allison, also had a question of how do you think, the current Russian war in the Ukraine will also affect, the discussion on or progress on transparency, but also maybe wider discussions within international peace and security in cyberspace. So, for example, the discussions taking place at the UN or elsewhere or regional organizations.
I think, sorry, I just got a little, can you hear me?
All
Okay,
good.
okay. A little box came up saying, should I unmute myself? And I thought I did. Okay. Yeah, good question. I think, from what I've seen so far, I feel like maybe there are two directions or two trends happening since the start of the war in Ukraine. One is that it has really spotlighted the role of cyber operations within armed conflict and within military action. And I think that is driving a greater level of attention to the issue within UN discussions and elsewhere. I think it's sort of bringing some kind of this momentum and helping to build public interest and maybe public pressure in the issue. But at the same time, it's also had a very polarizing effect, at least in the open-ended working group, which was already, kind of started with a polarized origin story, and then things got a little bit better and the conversations became quite constructive. But I think that it has now made it harder for states to talk about these issues. But at the same time, and I would believe it was the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs in her opening statements to the last session, that she really underscored that it's at these times where we really do need to kind of overcome these differences and try to work together and have a common conversation about the challenges that we're facing in cyberspace. So it's kind of going, in a bit of two ways.
Jim, do you maybe have anything to add on this? Because you're also been involved in this process. Like, how do you think it will change the discussions, if at all?
Well, some people call the current OEWG has gotten off to a very rocky start, and the program of action proposed by some countries has also gotten off to an even rockier start. So it's not encouraging, but I think that Under Secretary General Nakamitsu's point of view, which is, this is a 5-year mandate, and the initial discussions might be slow, but she believes we will see results. And I think what we might want to think about is, where can there be useful results that would benefit the international community? And that sounds a bit vague, but what I mean is we're not going to persuade the Russians and the Chinese, nor are they going to persuade us, right? So it's again the contest for the middle ground, the undecided, and how can democracies use their ability to be more open, their ability to be more collaborative, to help persuade people that some behaviors are unacceptable and that some responses are justified. So I hope the OEWG will move in that direction. I don't think it will, but until it can decide on a purpose that goes beyond the history of arms control, it may not get that much traction. A little grim, sorry about that.
Grim, but but thanks nonetheless, Jim. So moving on maybe to Max, I mean, you've also, you've talked previously also about, some of the cyber components within the war in Ukraine, basically, and we've expected, I think, or the expectations were at the beginning, like from all the experts, is that it would be, completely cyber dominant, and that would, be at the beginning of the invasion. Have we, do you think that does it live up to that expectation? And if so, like, how will that affect, you think, how, all the nations are they gonna spend a lot more on their cyber capabilities now and in the integration within their militaries as a response, or how do you see it affecting that kind of like progress on the cyber commands side of the discussion?
Yeah, it's a great set of discussions or questions, Luke, and I'm actually together with several others at ECRI, European Cyber Conflict Research Initiative, we're organizing a roundtable on exactly those questions tomorrow here in Tallinn. So I'm very curious what's going to come up. Let me stick to the kind of conventional discussion to start off with. So clearly, what we have seen over the past 3 months is a wide range of different activity. Perhaps early on, not as significant as some expected, but certainly we've seen, of course, a continuous development of a wide range of different wipers. I think we're now at the 7th or 8th variant used. We have seen a great deal of, which is significant and sometimes forgotten, the amount of leaks, data leaks that have taken place, hack and leak operations is impossible to keep up with. Of course, lots of DDoS operations. We've seen some interesting activity from several non-state actors and so on. The key question, of course, that still remains on the table is, one, exactly how integrated are these operations within the Russian forces? Are they just occurring in parallel or kind of at the same time? Or do we really see these kind of multiplier effects where maybe a cyber operation can truly enhance the effectiveness of a more conventional operation? And the second, and that I think is an academic debate, but also clearly a very much of a policy one that will continue to come up the coming years. Okay, sure, we've seen quite a bit of activity, but how strategically or tactically impactful has it truly been? And that's one that I would argue is still kind of very much up to debate. I feel both sides have a sufficient amount of interesting data to work with to kind of make a case either way you want to go. So that one point. To go back, because I believe you raised a couple of different questions. The first one on like, what should we have expected and why didn't we see this immediate, perhaps cyber blitzkrieg or whatever you may want to call it at the start of the war? There are a number of different explanations for it. The first one is, we have seen a number of different planning failures on the Russian side, and cyber is one of them. Second is, it didn't, and closely connected to it, it didn't expect the war to take sufficiently long, nor needed to have cyber, and as a result of that, we haven't seen operational activity. The third one, which is one, Ukraine Russia is incapable of doing so. It's that third one that I actually don't find overly convincing, particularly because of the repeated operations that we have seen actually before the war, particularly against the power grid. Now, of course, we can see often in times of conflict significant configuration changes, and you're more aware of potential adversarial activity. And yes, perhaps some of it has been disrupted by the US and other actors, but that kind of capability argument in and of itself doesn't do it for me.
Luke, maybe I can jump in on this real quickly, because I have a piece that's about to come out, should the editors ever spring it, which seems to be difficult. But this came up earlier in the discussion. I think one of the benefits of having a cyber command is that the Ukraine conflict shows, the Russian invasion shows the need to have adequate staffing and intelligence support for any cyber operations. And so one of the primary functions of Cyber Command is to create that staffing background that allows you to undertake operations. The other thing that, and this just can't be picked up overnight, right? So having a command staff at Cyber Command is an exceptional advantage and something to think about in the index. The other part is, and as we've seen from the Russians, is that cyber operations have to be integrated into joint operations. They have to be, for maximum effect, coordinated with air, ground, I would say naval in some cases, not in this conflict. But so the emphasis on staff command, the emphasis on joint operations. Problems for the Russians. Ukraine is interesting in one way because it suggests that for smaller countries that think about cyber in advance, defense can have an advantage, right? And so we've always said that there's an advantage in cyber attacks. I'm not sure Ukraine shows that. It also suggests, however, that smaller countries or countries that aren't prepared in terms of staffing and intelligence won't do as well on offense. So in some ways, Ukraine is making us recalculate what's essential for useful cyber operations, what the balance is between defense and offense. But I think that the emphasis on staffing and on intelligence, or you could even call it reconnaissance, it's an ongoing activity. It's something that needs to be done constantly for there to be maximum effect. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Jim. I see a two-finger from Max, if I'm correct. Max, please.
Yeah, just a quick two-finger plugging in a report that is also coming out from a colleague of mine, Stefan Susanto, on the IT army, actually, and on staffing. One thing, like, it has been so widely discussed, the Ukrainian IT army, it didn't set up a cyber command in time for this conflict to punch back, but now the IT army can do so. And also there, still, right, when you really delve into it, you see really interesting dynamics. That on the one hand, you've got this core group that tries to do more advanced operations. And then the struggles of, the actual Ukrainian government to leverage outside of its own core trusted people that are physically there to leverage the rest. Yes, you can use them for DDoS attacks, but what else can they exactly do, and how do you want to use that in a responsible manner? These are really fascinating questions that kind of Ukraine provides a fascinating use case for, and we're going to see in the coming months even more how that's going to play out.
Yeah, and just to be sure, Max, this is the militia, the quote unquote militia group, right? So this is mostly where they called upon all actors, including non-state actors, who are willing to help in both defending and offense.
Exactly, but when the moment you start to delve deeper into it, you see this is a layer cake, right? This is not just what some people try to term it. It's either a bunch of non-state actors joining, or it's the state. It's actually a you will find first a core group that then does certain operations, but then you see it, of course, layered all the way to the widest layer is simply a signal channel, channel that perhaps many of us are on as well, just to see what it's going to come up. And sometimes this widest ring is reported with 400,000 IT army people. But actually, when you start to delve into it and see what each layer actually is able to do for the Ukrainian government, then you get into an absolutely fascinating analysis. Because of course, the moment you go further in the layers, the less control the government has, and also the less able it is actually to use it sometimes in an effective manner.
Yeah, great. It's not a monolithic entity, so thanks for that, Max. So, Alison, I was wondering if, because there's some questions regarding the Cyber Arms Watch itself, which I will take afterwards. Are there any more concluding remarks or comments from your end?
Not particularly. I think early, I mean, it's been a really interesting discussion. I definitely have a lot that I want to chew over afterward and think about. It's been good, a good conversation. I think, you know, earlier, Luke, you and I have been talking a little bit about sort of like the added value of more transparency in the first committee discussions, and we've touched on that a little bit already. So I might just round things off with a few concluding points on that I think there could be more value brought to these UN discussions by having greater transparency. It would improve their value add and their impact by making them a little bit more rooted in the reality of the current status of cyber conflict and operations, and would also help to build trust and confidence among the member states. You know, I think we have heard a few states referencing their offensive cyber policies, either at the first committee itself or in the current open-ended working group or the past open-ended working group. I don't know what happened in the GGEs. Jim would know more about that. But yeah, one of the criticisms that we often hear about UN-based discussions is that they do happen in something of a vacuum, or that they talk about issues in an abstract or oblique way in order to avoid getting politicized and then be able to take decisions or not be able to take decisions by consensus. And certainly this is a touchy issue, and I think that the political positions about offensive cyber operations and military uses of cyber operations, because other member states are raising concern about that, you know, they kind of align with where states fall on other touchy issues. And right now, as Jim alluded to, and I mentioned too, is that if conversations in the OEWG are definitely a little tense right now. But I think that if more states use the opportunity of these forums, which do have a very wide and universal participation, to share about their capabilities, to talk more about these things, it could really help to set good examples and be an encouragement for others to do the same, and at the same time help to restore some trust and confidence. And I think, you know, going back to what I said in my opening remarks about what are some of the practical actions that the international community can do to encourage greater transparency, there are a few specific initiatives underway within these UN forums, you know, whether it's in the context of this national survey on norms implementation, or in annual reports from member states to the Secretary General. I think that these are spaces and places where we can start to encourage a more specific conversation and contributions about capabilities and other areas where we need more transparency.
Great, thanks a lot, Alison. So I'm just going to bundle some of the questions on the Cyber Arms Watch together and then basically conclude. So we also have one speaker less, so we're just going to conclude a little bit earlier so people can enjoy for the rest of their evening or the afternoons. So first one is, how do you interpret that L-Toter as a common idea was behind Stuxnet? You know, that was never basically formally acknowledged by the suspected party. Well, the thing is, really no government formally acknowledges afterwards. I mean, even when we, when Russia has been, or some other nations have been attributed by other nations or by private actors, they always deny, or they often deny, or they ask, where is the proof? Obviously still, you know, saying that, you know, one thing that you have the capability and then not taking responsibility for it. Yes, that may be a criticism against transparency to that end, but I would say it's not only that suspected nation that doesn't acknowledge it afterwards, it's the majority of nations who doesn't do that. And I mean, that's something for us, you know, it's just a matter of fact, or that's how we've perceived it. So it's not something that we have entered into the calculation of how we distinguish between the degree of transparency between nations. We really just looked at what they declare, what did they say about their own capabilities, and compare that to outside perceptions thereof. So I think that's one of the first components. And then considering countries such as Russia, Iran, and the PRK are inherently authoritarian, it should be clear that there are no prior interests in sharing anything on the cyber domain. So why is it then relevant to measure information transparency from autocracies? Well, I mean, just because they are not, it still makes sense to look at them. I feel like, if anything, this could be a resource that could be used, when you're faced in sometimes these discussions where a nation doesn't want to engage on anything that is remotely touched upon by offensive capabilities, being it IHL or any other topic, because it would signify a militarization of cyberspace or any other argument. While we actually know that they engage in this thing, there's actually now resource that you can point towards. Obviously, for a lot of the experts there already, this is not a surprise, and you can point to a lot of different things. But we would still say that it is good to measure and sometimes even see small nuances between nations, right? Russia is not China in this perspective. There's still differences between those. The Chinese have actually published more now recently, mostly in their military documents still. So, it's still good to see, bring in a little bit of nuance between those two and actually have a resource that tries to collect all that data together basically and offer it in a one-stop shop for diplomats, researchers, you name it. So I'd say those are basically concludes the Q&A. So we're still 10 minutes ahead, so I just want to conclude already. I'd like to thank first of all of our speakers, Alison, Jim, Mox. Thank you very much for being here and for launching this resource with us. Saskia Boynes and Municipality of The Hague. Obviously, thank you for your generous support in launching this resource. And obviously, thanks to everybody who was here. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and I hope that you will find this a useful tool or a resource for whatever research or work you'll be doing afterwards. So don't hesitate to go to the HCSS website. It's at hcss.nl. We have a landing page for it. Again, all the report and all the underlying data of the monitor is publicly available. And if you have any feedback on the methodology, the data, how we labeled anything, there's also a form there that will allow you to basically provide that feedback on a very tailored way. So once again, I thank you all for joining us here today, and I wish you all a very good afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are. And thank you very much. Goodbye.